Learning basics and fundamentals is all well and good, but it's no fun. No fun unless you put it into practice, right? Right. No fun, I tell you. Welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor, everybody. Well, the episode I did a couple weeks ago on the basics of glazing and layering. As I mentioned, I would probably do some other episodes, and basically what I want to do is some demonstration, showing you how to put it into practice. Just showing you where the rubber meets the road. Nothing earth-shattering, nothing super tricky. It's just good fundamental technique. And in the case of glazing and layering, it can get a little bit tedious. It's actually the way I really love to paint. I'm working on this botanical. It's in process. I won't do a whole episode of this painting from start to finish. I'm probably going to work on a workshop where you can see that on Skillshare. But this is taking hours and probably weeks. I've already been working on it a week. These are the basic glazes, and I've already done a little bit of deepening and glazing in this flower, and that's what you're going to see on this video. So this is kind of after the fact. Essentially, that's the way glazing works for me. I do an initial painting or wash where most of the color is put down as an initial flat wash or some wet and wet gradations with slight modeling. Then I go back and spend some time glazing to bring values closer in line where I want them in places, to deepen, to get the overall value and contrast of the entire painting to pop and right where I want it, and to add the subtle color changes where I want them. So let me show you in this video how I did the glazing to model the contrast in these flower petals. This is an ornamental plum from my yard back when it was blooming a couple months ago. The blossoms are a lot like peach blossoms, very similar. I kind of made up my own composition here, but this is the initial washes, but it's what I would call the first pass on all the initial washes. So now the task before me is glazing, to adjust values as we talked about in the glazing lesson. Adjust values and add subtle color changes and add that pop, that contrast. And I'm going to do all of that in glazing because this is a very tight, realistic rendering. I've already started here, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to work on some petals and maybe a part of a leaf, just to give you the idea of how I do the glazing process. I've actually started on this, that's why it looks darker. But even with the flower petals, I want to try to bring them along equally, because it's very easy if you don't do that you'll get one petal too dark. When you go to finish the other ones, then you'll say, I shouldn't have made it that dark. And it's real hard to lighten effectively in watercolor. Now in glazing, I start with broader washes, and the initial washes that I've already done were that kind of wash. They were broader. And what I do after this, or as I get to the smaller washes, you'll understand what I mean when I say broader. I've switched to a magenta, which is a little more intense. I'm trying to bring up the color intensity. So if you refer back to our basics on glazing, adjusting value and color, subtle color changes, that also includes intensity. And so I have a little kind of a wet and wet wash there, and I can charge into that glaze while it's wet. And it's lighter. I'm leaving it lighter down here as the leaf curls up. I have a light source coming from this way. One of the rules of thumb with glazing is light to dark. You can always make it darker. It's really hard to make it lighter. So if you're just not sure how dark you want something to be, do 2, 3, 4 or more glazes rather than one. These little highlights right here on the edge of the petal curling up are important. So I'm very meticulous about saving those and not painting over them. When I'm done, I decide they're really too hot, then, that's the time, when I'm near the end, that's the time I can go in and kind of glaze over those highlights. But initially, I'm very fastidious, I guess you would say, about saving them. Okay, I've got a pretty good amount of contrast right there in that petal, so I'm going to move on to another one. And as I get them all done, and then even start doing some leaves, I'll be able to tell, do I need to go darker yet? So we're going to work on this petal here. There's a good bit of shadow up under that curl. And this, again, I'm doing a fairly broad graduated wash, or blended wash. And this needs to stay fairly light down here, so I'm probably not going to touch that anytime soon. And in my reference, the one curling petal I'm looking at, that's very hot, so I'm probably going to leave that white. And that shadow is carried down that edge, so let's do a glaze down this edge with that intense color. And there's some texture in these petals, so if I feel like the effect and the contrast is getting close to what I need, I can start adding some of these little streaky looking things. But generally I don't want to add too much texture until I have the contrast the way I want it. Let's work on this petal here. Now this petal, there's a lot of what looks like shading, but that was all done wet and wet. So that's still all an initial wash. And it's a little bit variegated, a little bit too variegated. I've got sort of a violet here, and then I've got a kind of a pyrrole red here. I'm going to add these same magenta wash that I've been adding, and that's going to unify it. And that's another thing that glazes can do. They can take multiple colors or too much variegation and unify it. And now that violet color that I had painted in before in the initial wash is changing. I'm getting some nice color shift from my glaze. And just blending it out. Some of these petals probably will not take too much glazing. I won't need too much, in other words. It's a pretty drastic shadow on where that curls over. And I think this highlight here is a bit hot from the reference. But for now, I'm going to leave it and wait till I'm nearly done before I decide if I want to paint over it. Sometimes you can exaggerate, and I quite often do. You can exaggerate a highlight if, as you're judging the painting, you really think it needs it. It's your painting. You can do whatever you like, whatever you think works. So I only take reference as a starting point most of the time. I'm using a Mission Gold Magenta, mainly because I don't have an M-Gram Magenta. Mission Gold colors are just so sweet, so nice. Just a beautiful intensity to those colors. And I've had people ask me, well, is Mission Gold your favorite now? And, no, it doesn't mean I don't think they're just really great colors. It just means they're still kind of the new kid on the block, and there's still some unknowns. They're doing great for most people. There's probably a magenta in the M-gram line. I just don't have it. I don't really. Quinacridone Rose is close. It's not quite as intense. And somebody pointed out to me the other day, and it's really true, that they are just as happy to mix and match the paints on their palettes. And really, that's what most artists do. They don't necessarily just all use one brand. I just do it because I'm a reviewer on this channel, and so I keep my palettes segregated. I have a palette of Core, I have a palette of M-gram. I just got through making a palette of My Merry Blue. I have a palette of Sennelier. I have a palette of Schminke. And I do that basically for the purposes of this channel, so that I can review them as a group, use them, keep in mind that all the paints in that palette are of that make. I've been going over and over these. I probably have 3 glazes on this already. Generally, when you're glazing, if you're fairly dry with the paint, they dry pretty quick. So, and even if it's a little damp, as long as I'm staying drier than the wash that's down there, I can go ahead and add over it, and it'll blend. When I'm doing small glazed areas like this, I am very, very dry with my brush. I mean, there's just enough moisture. I have just enough. I don't dip into any new water. I just go in here and pick up a little bit of pigment. And even kind of blot it off on there. And that's very intense. I'm going to blot it off some more. And it's almost like using a pencil. It's so dry that I'm basically just rubbing off pigment right off the brush, like you would shade with a pencil. I hope you can see that pretty well. That is what I do a lot of the small glazing and blending. That's the technique I use. All right, let's go over here and work on this petal. Got heavier color and shade up here, shadow. The day I took these reference pictures, it was fairly overcast, so we have fairly sculptural light, meaning it's not heavy from one direction. It's mostly coming from overhead. But the petals twist and turn, and of course the curl up of the petals makes for shadow. So you kind of have to think a little bit, and I want to leave some very light areas. But where the petals curl up seems to be where they're the darkest. And that's looking pretty good, contrast-wise, at least for now. I'm going with a broader wash now, not quite as dry, because I'm covering a bigger area. blend out that edge. And this, it's hard to tell, but this petal curls up like this, and I can see the pencil mark. You probably can't see it. So that gets a hard edge, just a plain old flat wash. And that'll probably take a few more glazes once that's dry to get it back down. I hope me just kind of voicing my thought process is helping you understand how this process works. Probably the most fun part of this whole painting process is when you have the drawing done, you have your initial washes, and you're just going in and glazing in and popping up the contrast. All right, I'll back the camera out a little bit, give you a little more context. Let's work on a leaf, and you can just see how I've used the process applied to a leaf, which is really the same. This leaf just has its basic flat washes, so I'm going to start with, I usually go from bigger modeling areas to smaller, meaning the bigger washes that I need to add contrast and detail down to the smaller finite ones. I'm kind of using this as a rough guide, but I'm changing a few of the contrasts that I see. I'll start with mostly water, and this is going to be a sort of a charged glaze, a wet and wet charged glaze, which is a very, very pale wash, and then I'll charge in color. As I mentioned in my basic episode on glazing, it's okay to do wet and wet charging as long as the underneath layer is dry, the previous layer. The layer that you add as a glaze can be wet and wet, and you can charge in color. That's fine. And it's going to stay light down there, but I'm basically just going to bring it, the value down closer to the edge. And charging just helps me control that wash a little better over a larger area than the more dry brush glaze. Helps me get it smoother because the moisture helps you out. It helps spread the value and the tone, the pigment. If it were a real small area, I could just blend it by hand, but okay. So I think you can see now I'm getting a subtle gradation from this edge where I wanted to darken that edge. That edge is curling up, so it's limiting the light. All right, I'm gonna add some contrast here. It's smaller so I can blend it by hand. Already that life, hopefully you can see already that leaf is taking on some life. I think I can work on the underneath part of this curl. And there's some red-brown tinges, so I'm going to bring that in. And I'm going to go ahead and add a tinge of darker green to that edge. And since that's wet, I got to be careful not to touch that or I'll bleed into that. Charge in a little more shading while it's wet. And the light is coming this way, but because that leaf is turned up, it's going to kind of shade the edge. That's pretty dry. I'm going to go to the dry brush effect. So I've added some pigment. I don't have much water in my brush at all. And add that there. Dry it even further. And a little bit of shading right there. Alright, so we're going to leave that leaf alone, and I think that will require a little more work, so we'll come back to that. And one more thing I want to do before the end of this video is go ahead and add some depth and intensity to this petal right here. That way I will have worked on all 5 of those petals, all 6 of those petals. And I want to leave it light here, so I'm only going to bring it down on that edge, the value. Now I've still got some work to do on this curl over here because that's not fully painted in yet. And I'm just coming back while it's wet and doing repeated charging until I get that value where I want it. Alright, so I hope that was a good reinforcement to my episode on glazing basics and gave you some insights as to how I handle it in a real situation. And it doesn't always have to be used in such a realistic piece. It can be used, you know, to glaze over loose areas too, just because you want to change the value or make subtle color changes. But in this case, I'm doing a very tight rendering, and it's especially good for that. Hope that helps you. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you watching, liking, subscribing, all that good stuff. Thanks so much, patrons. You encourage me every single day, and I really mean that. You are the sponsor of this show, and I couldn't be doing it without you. And we will see everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.